So that was a very interesting oral argument that we had in Rupp v. Becerra. Let's talk about this. But real quick before we jump into this video, if you think that there's no such thing as an assault weapon, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. So today, October 8th, 2020, we had oral arguments in the Rupp v. Becerra case. And if you're not familiar with what all Rupp v. Becerra entails, you can click this tab right there and it'll take you to another video that I did where I talked about Rupp v. Becerra. But essentially, Rupp v. Becerra is a challenge to California's Assault Weapons Control Act. And California's Assault Weapons Control Act has multiple parts in it, and it did multiple things because it kind of progressed over years. Originally, California's Assault Weapons Control Act was a prohibition on specific makes and models of specific firearms and rifles. And then it evolved over time to include what we know today as the general bans on what California considers assault weapons, mainly being semi-automatic centerfire rifles that are configured in specific ways to where then California considers them to be assault weapons. So that is what Rupp v. Becerra is all about, is a challenge to California's Assault Weapons Control Act. And so this case has made its way all the way up to the Ninth Circuit, and now today we had oral arguments by a Ninth Circuit panel, and it was made up of two Trump nominees and one Obama nominee. Judge Hurwitz was appointed by Obama, and then Breeze and Bumate were appointed by Trump. So we were already going into this case with a 2-1 lean potentially in favor of the Second Amendment, especially also because we were coming off the heels of Duncan v. Becerra, which you heard cited a lot in this oral argument. And in Duncan v. Becerra, that dealt with California's ban on what they deem large capacity magazines. And a 3-judge panel in Duncan v. Becerra found that California's ban on large capacity magazines violated the Second Amendment. And I would have to say that my initial takeaways after listening to this a couple times is that this went a lot better than I thought it was going to go. And I think a lot of you will probably have the same takeaway that even Judge Hurwitz, who was the Obama appointee, had a lot of critical questions for the state of California's representative, as well as it seemed like Judge Hurwitz was being actually very fair in his questioning to both sides. It didn't seem like he came into this with any preconceived notion one way or another of how he was going to judge. It seemed like he was actually asking very important questions and was actually trying to define how exactly he was going to judge on this exact case. It seemed like he was actually listening to what the parties were saying. And a couple times you actually heard Judge Hurwitz say to our representative of us, the plaintiffs, saying that he wasn't intending to spar with the representative, essentially saying he's not trying to be in combat with them. He was just trying to figure out the limit and scope of what exactly our argument was. He was trying to figure out how far our argument went and what our stance actually was. And so that was very refreshing to actually see. And I think that is represented almost immediately when our side opened up our arguments, and kind of out of the gate, there was a little bit of stumbling and back and forth between Hurwitz and our representative about the scope of the Second Amendment and actually the type of analysis that should be heard in this specific case. There was an instance right there at the beginning where our representative was talking about if this is something that affects the core of the Second Amendment, and if it is a categorical ban or an outright ban, it would fail under any amount of scrutiny, and really that the court here, the 3-judge panel, wouldn't even really need to look at whether strict scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny would be applied, because like we saw in Duncan v. Becerra, if it is something that strikes at the core of the Second Amendment and is an outright ban, it would fail under either one. And then there was a little bit of back and forth between Hurwitz and our representative, where it seemed like maybe Hurwitz kind of misinterpreted what exactly our representative was saying. And then there was some discussion of where exactly does Heller say that. And our side, I think, did a fair job of combating that and actually came back later and kind of clarified his position. Essentially, all he was saying is that, like in Duncan, if the court here finds that these types of rifles are protected by the core of the Second Amendment, then an outright ban of that firearm that is protected under the Second Amendment would fail regardless of the type of scrutiny that this court would apply. It wouldn't even matter if they applied intermediate scrutiny, like Duncan said in their case. Doesn't even matter, it would still fail and still violate our Second Amendment rights here in the state of California. And then there was an interesting question by Judge Bumate to our side, and it was a question of how exactly should the 3-judge panel here address the various characteristics or items that are attached to California's Assault Weapons Control Act that make various firearms being considered assault weapons here in the state. And our side kind of went back and forth, and it was actually interesting because after there was some back and forth with Judge Bumate, where our side said, yes, I think you should look at the analysis based on each single item or feature on that list in the Assault Weapons Control Act. And what they're referencing there is California Penal Code 30515, where there's multiple characteristics outlined in there. He said that this 3-judge panel should look at that and kind of make their determination based on each feature. But then Judge Hurwitz chimes in. He says, well, wouldn't that kind of cut against your argument? Wouldn't it just be easier for our court if we were going to rule in favor of your position to just say that these semi-automatic centerfire rifles are protected under the Second Amendment, and it really doesn't matter what type of features are attached to them or not attached to them or restricted based on them. Simply if the semi-automatic centerfire rifles that we're talking about in the Assault Weapons Control Act are protected under the Second Amendment, that's really all as far as you need to go, and the type of features that are attached to them or on them really doesn't matter. So as you can see, like I was referencing earlier, Judge Hurwitz has sometimes kind of gave our side a little softball and said, hey, I'm going to help you clarify your argument or make it easier for you to persuade me towards your side of arguments, because here he's saying, I don't really like the fact that we have to get into looking at the various features of what would make a rifle protected under the Second Amendment or not. Really, the question that we should just address here is whether a semi-automatic centerfire rifle that's controlled under the Assault Weapons Control Act is protected by the Second Amendment or not. And that's really all as far as we have to go, correct? And our side said, yes, I agree with that completely. That's really all you have to look at is a semi-automatic centerfire rifle, like mentioned here in the Assault Weapons Control Act, protected under the Second Amendment. If it is, then you go to determine what type of scrutiny needs to be applied. And then there was some back and forth from Judge Hurwitz to our side where it seemed like he was trying to find the limits of our argument on our side. And then you also heard a little bit of discussion about historical text, traditions, stuff like that. Actually historical basis for regulations on semi-automatic centerfire rifles. And our side, I think, did a very good job fielding these questions by the judges by essentially saying that the amicus brief that was filed by Everytown that talked about various state regulations of machine guns or rifles of this type isn't enough persuasive authority. It's just a one-offs here and there from states based on poorly written statutes which were eventually either completely eliminated or amended after the fact, because what they did was not actually what was intended. They were never intended to go after semi-automatic centerfire rifles like we're talking about here. So now let's move to the state's representative and what he was saying in his part of the oral arguments and what exactly did some of the judges say in response to what he was saying. So right out of the gate, the state representative tried to argue that this is not an outright ban on all types of rifles. It is a subcategory ban. It is a ban on semi-automatic centerfire rifles that have various features attached to them. And he was trying to parse and essentially almost trying to argue that this is not some sort of overarching ban. Instead, it's only a ban on subsets of rifles. But of course, what he's failing to recognize in his argument, or what he's kind of hiding the ball in this, is although he's saying that it's a ban on a particular type of rifle, a semi-automatic centerfire rifle with various features, that actual classification of a rifle encompasses a lot, and I mean a lot of rifles, not just here in the state of California, but just in the US in general. A semi-automatic centerfire rifle that has a detachable magazine with various features on it that are listed by the state of California encompasses almost every single semi-automatic centerfire rifle in the US, and that almost every type of rifle that a manufacturer or a gun manufacturer makes. There are some one-offs which you heard him represent, and then our side also brought back some examples as well, like the Mini 14 that maybe don't fall into these classifications, or like Ruger 1022s don't fall into classification. But as far as what California does ban by its language, it encompasses a majority of rifles here in the US. And you heard Judge Hurwitz push back on this because he was saying, I understand what the language says and that you're trying to parse out and saying this isn't an outright ban. It only bans semi-automatic centerfire rifles with a detachable magazine with various features. That's what the state representative says. Judge Hurwitz in response says, I understand what the language says, but in a practicality, in the real world application of this statute, of this California Penal Code, what does that look like? Does that ban a lot of firearms, a lot of rifles, or does it not? And the answer to that is it bans a lot of rifles. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware that the implications of this exact language here in the state of California makes it so that we pretty much can't have a lot of rifles in that specific configuration. And the rifles that would standardly come in those types of configurations that are made by manufacturers in that standard configuration, we can't have them because of the language. And then they got to this section that I referenced earlier where the state representative is pushed on whether he would concede that this type of rifle that we're talking about, the AR-15, is owned by a lot of individuals, not just in the state of California, but in the US in general. And he said, no, we can't really concede that. We don't know how many there are. And actually, Judge Bumate was the one who asked that, like, couldn't you concede that this is a commonly used, commonly owned rifle? And like mentioned in Duncan, it is one of the most quintessential rifles in the US. And the state representative said, well, I can't concede that. And you can almost see on Judge Bumate's facial expression that he's like, are you kidding me? We know it and you know it that this is one of the most commonly owned rifles in the US. And here is where you actually have Judge Hurwitz chime in after the back and forth from Judge Bumate and the state representative, where he said that it almost seems obvious that there are a lot of these types of rifles out there on the market owned by people. And then they get into a distinction about, okay, let's assume that they are commonly used. Then let's talk about the type of restrictions that you could have on them. And that's where they get into discussions about where the state representative is saying that these type of rifles don't fall under the Second Amendment because they are military grade weapons. And then he tries to say that there is no distinction between a semi-automatic centerfire AR-15 and a military grade M16. He is trying to see them as one of the same, but he got a lot of pushback on this. And it was actually interesting because the state representative tried to cite Heller as far as M16s, where Scalia was writing about the M16, where he says that maybe M16s could be banned. And actually the distinction that they were trying to draw was, and actually Judge Hurwitz brought this up, is that Scalia did not say that M16s or AR-15s as a military equivalent can be banned or regulated. He was simply saying that maybe, who knows? We would have to look at that, but we're not looking at that in that specific case of Heller. So maybe they're the same as M16, maybe AR-15s could be banned, but that's not what we're dealing with here. So the state representative kind of got a lot of pushback on that, specifically by Judge Hurwitz. And then one of the last things I want to bring up as far as the state representative, when he was getting asked the questions, had to do with Judge Bumate asking about what level of scrutiny should be applied to this specific language in the state of California if we found that these type of arms are commonly owned. And the state representative here said that we should apply intermediate scrutiny because if you find that there is some sort of other reasonable alternative, then that means that it's okay and you apply it under intermediate scrutiny. Then Judge Bumate did something very interesting. He asked him, do we do that with any other type of constitutional right here in the US? For example, in the First Amendment, do we say that, yes, you have a constitutional right to your freedom of speech, but you have a reasonable alternative, and therefore we can restrict this aspect of your freedom of speech? And then in response to that, the state representative used the classic example of yelling fire in a theater as an example of, well, we say that we can restrict your speech in that aspect. But Judge Bumate did something very interesting in response to that. What he said is, well, actually, the difference in that is that yelling fire in a theater is not protected First Amendment speech. We would say that that doesn't even fall under the First Amendment, which is much different than what we're talking about here in the Second Amendment, where we're saying a type of firearm falls under the Second Amendment's protection, but then the state of California is saying, hey, we can prohibit that. We can put an end to you being able to purchase and possess that because you have these other firearms out there that you can get. And I think it really signals to you at least where Judge Bumate's mind at is that he's saying this is a core constitutional protected right that we're talking about here. And the fact that you are saying that there is some sort of other reasonable alternative, we don't accept that in any other type of constitutional right issue or question. We don't accept that in the First Amendment. We don't accept that when we're dealing with the Fourth Amendment or anything else. We don't accept that type of rationale. So why would we accept it here with the Second Amendment? So that was very refreshing to kind of hear Judge Bumate push back on the state on that specific issue. So what are my general takeaways after watching all this? I mean, you heard me talk a lot about what both sides were asked by the judges and kind of what some of the critical points were back and forth from the representatives to the judges. And my takeaway is that this might go pretty favorable to us. I might even say that this has potential to go 3-0 in our favor because Judge Hurwitz was asking a lot of very interesting questions to the state, had a lot of questions that pushed back against the state, as well as he pretty much accepted himself that these type of rifles are commonly owned, that a lot of people own them, and therefore it more than likely and probably does fall under the protection of the Second Amendment. And so then really the only question you have after that is what type of scrutiny should be applied. I think this has a lot of potential. This could have a lot of legs, and this could have a lot of implications as well. If this 3-judge panel rules 3-0, this will have implications for Miller down the road. Let's say that Judge Benitez and Miller also finds in our favor, puts an injunction on the Assault Weapons Control Act. Then Judge Benitez's decision is appealed up to the Ninth Circuit in a 3-judge panel. Well, we have Rupp v. Becerra right now that's been heard on oral arguments, is pending a decision by the 3-judge panel. If the 3-judge panel here says also that the Assault Weapons Control Act violates our Second Amendment rights, once Miller gets up to the Ninth Circuit, we already have a decision by a 3-judge panel. This 3-judge panel in Miller v. Becerra will simply have to follow what this panel here says in Rupp v. Becerra, and essentially also validate what Judge Benitez says that, hey, the Assault Weapons Control Act in the state of California clearly violates the Second Amendment. So hopefully that gives you some insight and some of my takeaways after I watched these oral arguments. Like I said, it was very interesting, and I'm really excited to see how this plays out, and I could see this going 3-0. And also, I think it maybe could go 3-0, or maybe even Judge Hurwitz maybe tipped his hand a little bit here. Is if you look in the background, if you watch this video, you can see two of our founding fathers kind of hanging up right above Judge Hurwitz. So he might not be as progressive liberal as we maybe thought he was. I don't know. I haven't read any of his other decisions, but it's just kind of interesting when we're talking about core, fundamental, constitutional rights like the Second Amendment, and then you have two of the founding fathers kind of just hanging above Judge Hurwitz as he's asking these questions. So I just thought that was interesting, and it made me chuckle a little bit. So I'm interested in what you guys thought after watching this. I'll put a link down below in the comment section and also in the details section to this video. I think the video is a string of all the cases that they heard. It starts at, I believe, like 57 minutes or something like that. So it's towards the end. So take a watch and then tell me down in the comment section below, what were your takeaways after watching this case? What do you think is going to happen? So if you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is join the Patreon page, and I'll put a link down below to the Patreon page. Also, just like, comment, subscribing, and make sure you hit that notification bell because that helps the channel analytics, helps us spread the word about the Second Amendment, and also what we have to deal with here in the state of California. So as always, thanks guys for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.